He told her the truth the way people confess to borrowing sugar, as if the words meant nothing, as if the confession itself carried no weight. And in that moment the quiet in the room felt heavier than any argument ever could, because when a person shrugs off betrayal like a forgotten errand, it fractures something deep inside the one listening. And I remember standing there, frozen in my own kitchen, watching the woman I thought I knew stare back at me with empty eyes while the life we had built dissolved in front of me without noise or drama. Only a dull, echoing silence that seemed to stretch endlessly into every memory I had of us. And as she spoke, I felt something inside me shift, not explode, not rage, but harden, as though my heart had decided that if it could no longer feel, it would at least survive. And that was the moment I realized I would not beg, I would not argue, and I would not plead for something she had already thrown away, because whatever we once were, she had already chosen to erase. And I was left standing in the aftermath of her indifference, trying to understand how a life built over years could be dismissed with a careless shrug, how the person who once promised loyalty could now act as though loyalty was optional, and how the home I believed in could suddenly feel like a stranger's house, full of echoes instead of warmth. As the air around me felt thick with disbelief, and my thoughts raced back to the early days when everything seemed simple, when love felt unbreakable, and when trust was something I never questioned. And now, faced with this cold confession, I realized that nothing is truly permanent when one person decides to walk away emotionally before leaving physically. And the pain of that realization cut deeper than anger ever could, because it forced me to confront a truth I never wanted to see. That sometimes people don't change suddenly. They drift away quietly until one day they reveal that they've already been gone for a long time. I was no longer the man I used to be when I built my business from the ground up, scraping by on late nights in stubborn determination, driving an old delivery van that rattled louder than my own doubts, believing that if I worked hard enough, life would eventually reward me with stability. And for a while, it seemed like it had, because I had a growing company, loyal workers, and contracts that kept us busy. And I thought that was proof that perseverance always paid off. Yet none of that prepared me for the collapse that began inside my own home, because success in one part of life does not shield you from devastation in another. And as I stood in the kitchen that night, I felt the weight of every choice I had made, every sacrifice I had endured, wondering how the same determination that built my livelihood could fail to protect my marriage. And it occurred to me that while I had been busy chasing stability, I had overlooked the quiet distance growing between us, the subtle signs that something had shifted long before I noticed. And now, surrounded by the hum of appliances and the dim glow of the overhead light, I felt like a stranger in the very space I had worked so hard to maintain, realizing that no amount of financial success could mend the emptiness left behind by betrayal, because trust, once broken, leaves a scar that no achievement can erase, and the irony of it all settled in my chest like a heavy stone, reminding me that while I had built something strong outside these walls, the foundation inside them had already crumbled beyond repair. That night stretched endlessly as I lay awake, replaying every conversation, every moment that now felt suspicious in hindsight, trying to trace the exact point where things went wrong. But the more I searched, the more I understood that betrayal is rarely a single event. It is a series of choices, each one quietly pulling two people further apart until the distance becomes impossible to ignore. And as dawn approached, I realized that my silence was not weakness but clarity, because there was nothing left to say that would change what had already happened. And instead of confronting her with anger, I decided that my response would be deliberate, thoughtful, and irreversible, something that would force her to understand that her actions carried consequences beyond her own emotions. And as I sat alone with the rising sun casting long shadows across the floor, I felt a calm settle over me, not because the pain had faded, but because I finally understood that holding onto someone who had already let go would only prolong the suffering, and that sometimes the strongest response is not confrontation, but acceptance followed by action. And in that quiet moment, I resolved to protect my dignity, my future, and the child who depended on me to show her what strength truly looked like, even when the world felt like it was unraveling around us. By morning, routine carried me forward, even as my heart felt heavy, and I moved through the house like a visitor, careful not to reveal the storm brewing inside me, because I knew that our daughter deserved normalcy for as long as possible. And as I prepared breakfast and watched her shuffle into the kitchen with sleepy eyes, I forced a smile that felt foreign on my face, realizing that sometimes love requires you to hide your pain so that someone else can feel safe. And as she spoke about school and small worries, I nodded and listened, all while reminding myself that she was the one person I had to protect through all of this, and that whatever happened next would shape how she understood trust, honesty, and resilience. And in that moment, I promised myself that no matter how broken I felt, I would not let bitterness define the future we would build together, because she deserved a parent who chose integrity over comfort, even when the truth was difficult to face. And as she left for the day, I felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that the choices I made now would echo through her life long after this chapter ended. With the house finally quiet, I began searching for answers, not out of spite, but out of a need to understand the full extent of what had been hidden from me. And as I scrolled through digital traces of her life, I felt like an outsider peering into a reality I was never meant to see, discovering moments that contradicted everything she had told me. And with each new detail, the picture became clearer, revealing that what she called a mistake was actually a carefully constructed double life. And though the truth stung, it also brought clarity, because it showed me that the problem was not my failure but her willingness to abandon honesty. And as I saved the evidence, I felt a strange sense of relief, knowing that I was no longer trapped in uncertainty. Because certainty, even when painful, is easier to face than doubt. And in that realization, I found the strength to continue, understanding that uncovering the truth was the first step toward reclaiming my life. When she left for work as if nothing had happened, her calm felt almost unreal, and I watched her walk away knowing that she believed she could control the narrative, unaware that her choices had already written a story she could not rewrite. And as I waited before taking my next step, I reached out for legal guidance, realizing that protecting myself and my child required more than emotion. It required strategy. And as I drove through the city, I reflected on how quickly trust can dissolve, leaving behind a void that no apology can fill, and how sometimes the people we love reveal sides of themselves we never imagined, forcing us to confront truths we would rather ignore. And yet, in facing those truths, we find the courage to choose a path that honors our values rather than our fears. The days that followed felt like living in two worlds, one where I played the role of a husband for appearances, and another where I quietly prepared for the inevitable, gathering proof and documenting every lie, not out of revenge, but out of necessity, because I refused to allow deception to define the future of my family. And as I pieced together the fragments of her secret life, I saw how carefully she had constructed a reality that excluded me. And while that realization cut deeply, it also freed me from the illusion that we could return to what we once were, because some doors, once closed, cannot be reopened, and all that remains is the courage to step forward into the unknown. When I finally entrusted everything to my attorney, I felt a mixture of sadness and resolve, because acknowledging the end of a marriage is like mourning someone who is still alive. And yet, as I listened to the calm explanation of my options, I realized that I was not powerless, and that reclaiming control over my future was an act of self-respect, not cruelty. And as I left the office, I felt lighter, not because the pain was gone, but because I had chosen to face it head-on, knowing that healing begins the moment you stop pretending everything is fine. That evening, as I watched her move through the house with careless ease, unaware of what awaited her, I felt a quiet certainty settle within me, because I knew that soon she would understand that actions cannot be erased by indifference, and that the truth, once revealed, has a way of reshaping everything. And as I prepared the final step, I reminded myself that this was not about punishment, but about accountability, and that sometimes the greatest act of self-respect is choosing to walk away from what no longer honors who you are. I left the house that night knowing that when she discovered what I had left behind, the life she believed she controlled would unravel in ways she never anticipated. And as I drove into the darkness, I felt both sorrow and peace, because while the road ahead was uncertain, it was also mine to choose. And for the first time since her careless confession, I felt free to begin again. The first light of morning found me sitting alone in a quiet cafe across town, the kind of place where the smell of burnt coffee clings to the air and strangers mind their own stories. And as I stared at my phone, vibrating endlessly on the small wooden table, I knew exactly what was happening back in the house I had just left behind, because the truth I placed there was finally being seen. And even though I had prepared myself for this moment, my chest still tightened with every unanswered call. Not out of regret, but out of the strange grief that comes when a chapter closes for good. And as I silenced the device and took a slow breath, I realized that my life was no longer about reacting to her choices, but about choosing what kind of man I wanted to be from this moment forward. And in that stillness, surrounded by the low murmur of strangers, I felt something shift inside me, a quiet strength that reminded me I was capable of surviving what once felt impossible, and that no matter how painful the road had been, it had led me to a place where I could finally stand without depending on someone who no longer respected the life we shared. And for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to imagine a future that was not defined by betrayal, but by resilience, growth, and the promise of something new. By the time the legal process began in earnest, I had already accepted that the woman I once loved was no longer the person standing across from me in cold conference rooms. And as documents were exchanged and timelines dissected, I felt a strange sense of detachment, as though I were watching someone else's life unfold on paper, because the emotional storm had already passed, leaving behind only clarity and resolve. And as I listened to my attorney outline each step, I understood that justice is rarely dramatic, but it is steady, persistent, and rooted in truth. And while she attempted to rewrite the narrative, every false claim only revealed more of the deception she had woven, reminding me that lies cannot survive when faced with evidence and patience. And as the days turned into weeks, I learned that healing is not about forgetting, but about releasing the hold that pain has over your future. And in that release, I found the courage to rebuild, not just my life, but my sense of self. When the courtroom finally became the setting for our last chapter together, the air felt heavy with unspoken words, and as I stood beside my child, I felt a fierce determination to show her that integrity matters, even when the cost is high. And as the judge spoke, I realized that consequences are not acts of cruelty, but necessary boundaries that protect what is honest and just. And while the outcome reshaped our lives forever, it also marked the beginning of something new. A life rooted in truth rather than illusion. And as we left the building hand in hand, I felt a sense of closure that no argument could ever provide, because closure does not come from winning, but from choosing to move forward with grace and strength. In the months that followed, our home transformed from a place of tension into a space filled with quiet laughter and small victories. And as I watched my child rediscover joy in simple things, I understood that resilience is built one day at a time, through patience, honesty, and the courage to keep going, even when the past lingers in the background. And while the memories remained, they no longer defined us because we had chosen to grow beyond them. And in doing so, we created a future that felt lighter, freer, and filled with possibility. Every now and then, I would hear updates about her life, reminders of the choices she made and the consequences she now faced. And while there was no satisfaction in her struggles, there was peace in knowing that I no longer carried the weight of her decisions. Because I had learned that letting go is not about bitterness, but about reclaiming your own path. And as I focused on nurturing the life we were building, I realized that sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the freedom to start again without fear. As time passed, my business flourished in ways I had never expected, not because of ambition alone, but because I had rediscovered my purpose. And with each new opportunity, I felt a renewed sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought me here, understanding that even the most painful experiences can become stepping stones toward growth. And as I stood in my office one evening, reflecting on how far I had come, I felt proud not just of what I had achieved, but of who I had become. Conversations with my child grew deeper, filled with questions about trust, courage, and the meaning of doing what is right. And as I listened to her insights, I saw how adversity had shaped her into someone thoughtful and strong. And in those moments, I realized that the legacy I was building was not measured in success or stability, but in the values I passed on, because integrity, compassion, and resilience would guide her long after this chapter faded into memory. One quiet evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in soft hues, I felt a sense of contentment settle over me, not because everything was perfect, but because I had learned to embrace imperfection. And as I watched my child play in the fading light, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we would face them together, grounded in honesty and hope. Looking back, I no longer saw betrayal as the end of my story, but as the turning point that revealed my strength. And while the scars remained, they served as reminders of how far I had come. And as I continued to move forward, I carried with me the knowledge that life is not defined by what is taken from us, but by how we choose to rise afterward. And in that choice, I found my true freedom. Now, when I reflect on the journey that reshaped my world, I feel gratitude for the lessons it taught me. Because through loss, I discovered resilience, through pain, I found clarity, and through letting go, I learned how to begin again. And as I step into each new day with purpose and peace, I know that the future is no longer bound by the past, but open to everything I have yet to become.